the day the US dollar died, and nobody noticed. The world's strongest currency didn't die with an explosion. It died quietly on a Sunday evening in front of millions of television sets. For decades, people around the world believed the US dollar was unshakable, backed by the largest gold reserves and the unstoppable power of the American economy. But that strength was replaced by something else, something hidden. When the dollar lost its golden anchor in 1971, it didn't stay afloat by miracle or luck. It survived because of oil. In secret meetings and quiet deals, the United States forged a pact that would tie the dollar's future not to gold in vaults, but to barrels of crude half a world away. The moment the dollar was no longer backed by metal, it became backed by energy and by a geopolitical bargain few understood. Since that night, every bill in your wallet, every price tag, and every debt has been running on a kind of collective faith, a belief built on oil, power, and trust. It's hard to imagine today, but there was a time when every US dollar was quite literally a claim to gold held in American vaults. Gold was the foundation for trust, and trust was everything. If you held a dollar, you could redeem it for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, a guarantee backed by the Treasury and the greatest economic power of the post-war era. That standard gave the world stability. It meant nations could trade with confidence, knowing the value of money was tied to something real. By the late 196s, that promise was under threat. America was spending more than ever before on a distant war in Vietnam, on an ambitious space race, on a sweeping social agenda at home. Countries like France began to suspect that the US was printing more dollars than it could possibly cover in gold. One by one, nations lined up to cash their paper for metal. It was as if the world's biggest bank started to run out of deposit. Then came August 15, 1971. With inflation climbing and gold reserves draining, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. His speech lasted just about 15 minutes, but those 15 minutes rewrote global finance. He didn't call it the end of the gold standard. He called it a temporary suspension of convertibility, a pause meant to stop speculators. But there was no return. The temporary measure became permanent, and the old system died right there, in prime time. That single decision, made in a scramble to protect the American economy, changed how every country operates. It untethered money from the most trusted object in history and replaced it with a new idea. Money was whatever government said it was. Prices, savings, loans, and wages all would now float on confidence alone. The dollar didn't fall apart outright, but it transformed. It became a belief system, not a physical guarantee. That shift set off a chain reaction. Currencies around the world started to drift freely in value. Inflation surged, and developing nations, borrowing heavily in dollars, found themselves at the mercy of decisions made in Washington. Even today, when your paycheck buys a little less or the price of groceries creeps higher, you're still feeling aftershocks from that 1971 moment. And yet the dollar appears stronger than ever. It dominates world trade, oil contracts, and foreign reserves. It's treated as if no force could ever dethrone it. But behind the curtain lies a fragile truth. When the dollar left gold, its strength stopped coming from metal. It started coming from trust. Trust in a government to manage debt, trust in economies to keep using it, trust that nothing better will come along. That's what makes this history so strange and so critical. The US dollar didn't collapse. It evolved. Its power wasn't destroyed, but rebuilt on something far more human and volatile: belief. This is the story of how the world's most trusted currency died, revived itself through oil and politics, and became a pillar built on perception. To understand why nearly every nation still plays by America's rules, and why that might not last forever, we have to go back to where the dollar's power began, when it was made of pure gold. The birth of the dollar's power. Picture the world in 1944. Europe lay in ruins, cities bombed out, factories silent, currencies worthless. People traded cigarettes and canned food because national money meant almost nothing. Amid that devastation, the United States stood apart, its economy intact, its gold vaults overflowing. Roughly 3/4 of all the world's gold sat in Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve. That mountain of metal gave America unmatched leverage when the great powers met to redesign the global economy at a small resort in Bretton, New Hampshire. There, representatives from 44 nations met for weeks of negotiations that felt more like financial nation-building than diplomacy. The world's economies needed stability, trust, and a way to rebuild. So the delegates made an unprecedented decision: tie every major currency to the US dollar and tie the dollar itself to gold. It was a simple, elegant structure. 1 ounce of gold would equal 35 US dollars. Every other currency, pounds, francs, yen, would peg itself to the dollar at a fixed rate. The arrangement turned Washington into the financial hub of the planet. The reasoning seemed bulletproof. The US had more gold than anyone. Its economy produced half of the world's industrial output. Its military guaranteed post-war security. If any country could be trusted not to debase its currency, surely it was America. So the dollar became a kind of global insurance policy. A French company could sell wine to Britain, get paid in dollars, and sleep soundly knowing that those dollars could always be converted to gold if necessary. Confidence in the dollar meant confidence in trade. And for the first time in history, nearly the entire world economy ran through one nation's currency. By the late 194s and early 195s, the arrangement worked beautifully. Dollars flowed from the US into Europe through the Marshall Plan, helping to rebuild destroyed infrastructure and kickstart growth. Every shipment of machinery or steel that left New York or Detroit strengthened the dollar's grip. From Tokyo to London, each country's central bank stored dollars in its reserves as a kind of lifeline. To have dollars was to have access to global commerce, oil, and technology. The Golden Era made money feel almost mathematical. Each nation's currency moved within narrow limits against the dollar, with minor adjustments now and then. If a country's economy overheated or cooled, its central bank intervened using its dollar reserves to maintain the peg. The International Monetary Fund, created alongside the Bretton Woods system, acted like a referee to keep everyone honest. It all seemed orderly, almost scientific, a welcome change after decades of depression and war. But beneath that stability, something subtle was happening. The system depended on one enormous assumption, that the United States would always be able to supply dollars without losing its gold. At first, this wasn't a problem. The US had a trade surplus, meaning more goods were leaving than entering, and dollars were scarce outside America. But as Europe and Japan rebuilt, they began exporting more products to the US. Dollars accumulated abroad faster than gold could justify. In other words, the world was swimming in paper promises, while the metal behind those promises stayed put. Still, faith in America was so strong that few questioned it. If anything, the abundance of dollars became the lubricant of global growth. Every government wanted them. Every major contract, from cars to copper to crude oil, was denominated in dollars. Even countries with little direct trade with the US measured their exports in American currency. This alignment of gold, paper, and power created the first modern form of financial empire, one held not by colonies but by currency. Meanwhile, lawmakers in Washington viewed this dominance as proof of their nation's exceptionalism. They believed the rest of the world would eternally need American dollars and would therefore support whatever level of spending the US chose. And so began a pattern that would later prove fatal to the system, confidence turning into complacency. During the 195s, the US started spending heavily to maintain its global influence through foreign aid, military bases, and early Cold War commitments. Money flowed outward faster than gold flowed in. By the early 196s, some European economists began muttering about what they called the dollar overhang, the growing mismatch between the number of dollars in circulation and the gold available to back them. But for most policymakers, the idea of a dollar crisis was almost unthinkable. The dollar was America's national symbol. It was printed with patriotic assurances. In God we trust, and circulated in vast quantities around the planet. To everyday people, it appeared invincible. Even as small cracks began to appear, small fluctuations in exchange rates, slight inflation in consumer prices, the system carried on, buoyed by reputation and inertia. Yet history always finds weak points. The Bretton Woods arrangement had locked exchange rates in a world that was rapidly changing. Industrial recovery in Europe and Asia meant America could no longer dominate trade as easily as before. To stay competitive, other nations wanted flexibility, the ability to adjust their currencies more freely. But the system's biggest flaw came from inside the United States itself, the temptation to print more money to cover rising costs. The 196s brought enormous spending. The moon landing project demanded billions. The Vietnam War drained even more. Domestic programs designed to fight poverty and expand welfare added layers of expense. Rather than raise taxes, politicians simply issued more dollars. On paper, the US promised that each one could still be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. In practice, that promise was becoming impossible to keep. Foreign governments noticed. Some started to quietly redeem their growing piles of dollars for gold. Britain did it first in 1965. Then France famously sent a warship across the Atlantic to collect its share, a theatrical reminder that paper and promises were no substitute for coins in the vault. Each shipment out of Fort Knox shrank America's reserves and amplified nervous whispers in global market. Even so, the illusion held for a while. Most countries preferred to keep their dollars because trade depended on them, and holding gold earned no interest. The US reassured its allies that everything was fine, that gold reserves were sufficient, that confidence must be maintained. They were half right. Confidence was indeed the foundation, but it was starting to wobble. By the end of that decade, economists everywhere sensed the drift. The dollar was still as good as gold, officially speaking. But insiders knew that stability rested on math that no longer worked. More dollars existed abroad than could ever be redeemed. What began as an unbreakable monetary order was slowly turning into a global balancing act sustained by faith alone. And yet at that point, most of the world remained unaware. To everyone else, the dollar was still untouchable. That illusion of control, carefully built since Bretton Woods, was about to meet its first real test. The cracks were spreading through the golden promise, and one major shock away lay the decision that would end it entirely. Cracks in the golden promise! By the mid-196s, the world's confidence in the dollar was still strong publicly. Behind closed doors, however, it was eroding fast. The United States had stretched itself thin. The same government that had promised to protect the planet from communism was also trying to conquer poverty at home, win the space race, and maintain an expensive network of military bases around the world. Dollars flowed out in every direction. Gold did not. Each year, the gap widened. By 1968, the U.S. owed foreign governments and investors more than $40 billion, yet held barely $10 billion worth of gold. On paper, it could have worked if everyone simply agreed not to cash in. But of course, they did cash in. Confidence in money depends on the belief that it can be converted into something real, and when that belief wavers, people start testing it. European allies became some of the first to do so. In Paris, President Charles de Gaulle openly mocked the system. He accused Washington of enjoying an exorbitant privilege. It could print money to pay for foreign goods, while the rest of the world had to earn theirs through trade. He wanted out. In 1965, France began redeeming dollars for gold, and not just discreetly. It sent an entire naval ship to New York loaded with paper currency to be swapped for bullion. The message was clear. The world no longer trusted the American promise at face value. Other nations soon followed. West Germany, Switzerland, and Japan quietly began redeeming dollars as well. Each request forced gold out of American vaults and made the next request more likely. It was a silent run on the bank that everyone pretended wasn't happening. The U.S. Treasury scrambled to reassure nervous partners, releasing periodic statements about ample reserves and fair confidence. But inside the Federal Reserve, the arithmetic looked increasingly grim. For every ounce of gold left, thousands of paper dollars existed. The imbalance was irrefutable. All of this pressure came at a time when the American public was feeling the economic strain too. Prices of everyday goods crept upward, wages barely kept up. The war in Vietnam was costing billions each month, but bringing no clear victory. Domestic spending kept climbing, fueled by new welfare programs and infrastructure projects. Yet few politicians had the nerve to suggest raising taxes or cutting military budgets. The easier path was to keep printing. The printing presses in Washington became the lungs of an empire trying to do everything at once. The result was predictable: too many dollars chasing too few goods. Inflation began to rise slowly at first, then steeply by the end of the decade. By 1969, consumer prices were climbing at more than 5% a year, high for a generation that had grown used to stable prices. The government responded with partial wage controls, temporary freezes, and statements insisting that the fundamentals were strong. But investors and foreign governments could read the numbers. The gold reserve was shrinking month after month. Unbeknownst to most Americans, high-level meetings were taking place across Washington to figure out how to stop the bleeding. Officials debated ways to make the dollar more competitive, maybe raising the gold price, maybe imposing trade restrictions, maybe persuading allies to hold on to their paper assets just a bit longer. Each idea carried massive risks. Changing the gold price would look like a confession of weakness. Trade restrictions would anger Europe. Diplomatic begging would only spread rumors. There was no clean exit. Meanwhile, the global press picked up on small but telling signs. Financial newspapers reported unusual gold movements from Fort Knox. Rumors spread that the U.S. might secretly close the gold window altogether. The Treasury denied it repeatedly. But inside the White House, economic advisors were split. Some said, "Hold the line, reassure the world." Others argued, "If we keep paying out gold, we'll have none left by the end of the year." The line between stability and collapse was narrowing by the week. By 197, the dollar began to lose its aura. For the first time since World War II, foreign exchange markets showed clear signs of doubt. Traders started betting against the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Central banks spent heavily trying to maintain it, but the tide was turning. Even ordinary citizens in other countries began converting dollars into marks or francs. Everyone wanted assets that looked more solid than the greenback. Inside Congress, the issue barely registered as a full-blown crisis. Politicians were focused on domestic concerns, rising prices, falling approval ratings, an unpopular war. Most didn't realize that the global order built in 1944 was on life support. The average American still thought of the dollar as invincible. Newsreels showed stacks of gold bars gleaming under floodlights at Fort Knox, filmed intentionally to project eternal stability. Those images hid the uncomfortable truth that much of that gold was already spoken for by overseas claims. By the time Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, the situation had reached a quiet emergency. He inherited an economy that looked fine on the surface, but was hemorrhaging credibility abroad. In private, his Treasury Secretary warned that foreign central banks were within months of draining Fort Knox beyond recovery. Nixon's political instincts told him that a visible devaluation or gold restriction would signal defeat and trigger panic. Yet standing still would let the crisis fester. Behind the scenes, Nixon's team explored last resort options. One proposal suggested temporarily suspending gold redemption just for a few weeks to cool speculation. Another offered to raise the official gold price to around $42 an ounce, effectively admitting that the dollar had lost value. But every potential fix either harmed America's reputation or risked global backlash. The administration needed a decision that appeared strong and temporary, but that, in practice, would change everything. All through 1971, the numbers worsened. Foreign claims on American gold exceeded what the Treasury could deliver. Speculators shorted the dollar, central banks hoarded gold, and panic began to simmer. In the first half of that year alone, nearly $3 billion in gold left U.S. reserves. Diplomats from Europe demanded emergency consultations. Japan requested clarity on future exchange rates. It felt like a run on national credibility. In the summer of 1971, news reached Washington that Britain was about to request a massive gold conversion, one that the U.S. probably couldn't fulfill without exposing its weakness. The president's advisors sounded the alarm. Either close the gold window now or risk an outright financial collapse. The choice was stark. Preserve the illusion of stability by ending convertibility, or let the illusion destroy itself. Nixon, ever conscious of how things looked on television, knew he had to act decisively and publicly. He prepared what would become one of the most consequential addresses in modern history. Still, he framed it as a measure of strength, not desperation. The world would learn about it not from rumors or leaks, but from a live announcement broadcast on a Sunday evening. And so, as the summer heat settled over Washington and the pressure built to unbearable levels, one man prepared to do the unthinkable. The United States, the country that had guaranteed the world's monetary order for a generation, was about to pull the plug on its own promise. The cracks in the golden system had widened into fractures no amount of reassurance could repair. What began amid triumph at Bretton Woods was now ending in quiet disbelief. The hour had come for the president to make his move. The night Nixon broke the system, August 15, 1971, a humid Sunday evening in Washington. Americans gathered in front of television sets expecting the usual nightly news, commercials, maybe a baseball score. Instead, the program was interrupted. A solemn image appeared. President Richard Nixon seated behind his desk in the Oval Office, an American flag to one side, the presidential seal gleaming behind him. His words, calm and measured, would end a global system that had held the world together for a generation. Earlier that month, Nixon had retreated with his top economic team to Camp David for what they called an economic summit. The group included Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a handful of trusted aides. They brought piles of charts showing the same alarming message. Gold reserves were evaporating, inflation was rising, and foreign governments were demanding more redemption than the Treasury could supply. Connally, a Texan known for blunt talk, reportedly said, "Mr. President, the world is draining our gold and laughing at us while they do it." Few in that room disagreed. Behind the calm setting, panic lingered. Britain's government had just requested to exchange large sums of dollars for gold, enough to cut remaining reserves in half. Economists warned that if Britain got its shipment, other nations would line up next, leaving America essentially bankrupt. The Bretton Woods Foundation was collapsing in slow motion, and no one could stop it with polite diplomacy. Nixon's instinct was to take control before events humiliated his administration. He wanted to appear decisive, not desperate. At Camp David, the group debated options into the night. Should they devalue the dollar, freeze wages, blame foreign nations? Each idea came with political risk. Nixon was approaching re-election season and feared anything that smelled of economic weakness. Finally, after hours of argument, Connally proposed an unprecedented combination: close the gold window completely, impose a temporary freeze on wages and prices, and slap a 10% tax on imports to protect American industry. It was a mix of boldness and nationalism, tailor-made for television. The president asked if such a move would be legal. Connally's half-joking answer summed up the attitude in the room. "It's legal if you say it is, Mr. President." The message was clear: lead first, justify later. By Sunday morning, they had their decision. The United States would stop converting dollars into gold, temporarily, to protect its currency and jobs. The economists in the room knew it wasn't temporary. Once the door closed, there was no reopening it without chaos. But the words softened the blow and gave the illusion that this was an emergency measure, not the end of an era. Nixon rehearsed the speech several times that day. He understood the stakes: the nation's trust in its money, its credibility abroad, and his own political legacy. Television cameras were set up in the Oval Office that evening. The broadcast interrupted the popular Western series Bonanza, ensuring maximum attention. When Nixon began speaking, his tone was steady, even reassuring. He framed the situation as a patriotic defense of America against international money speculators. Few watching realized that those speculators included central banks of allied nations. He announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to stamp out the menace of inflation. Then came the crucial line: "I have directed Secretary Connally to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." It sounded almost routine, just another policy adjustment. But those words quietly tore the final link between paper money and the metal that had underpinned global trust for centuries. Inside the Treasury, officials listening live understood instantly. Some applauded, others felt sick. Decades of economic orthodoxy had just been flipped inside out. The United States had promised every dollar could be traded for gold at $35 an ounce. That promise was now void. The dollar was officially a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the credit and faith of the U.S. government. Abroad, the reaction was instant disbelief. European finance ministries scrambled through the night, calling emergency meetings. In London, dealers described the next morning's gold market as bedlam. Prices shot upward within hours. By midweek, exchanges closed temporarily to digest the shock. The Smithsonian Agreement, signed only months later as a patch-up fix, would attempt to restore fixed rates, but by 1973, even that would crumble. The world's currencies were now adrift. Nixon's team celebrated publicly. Stock prices jumped, and opinion polls surged in his favor. On the surface, the announcement looked like a patriotic masterstroke. Factories cheered the import surcharge. Wage earners liked the idea of a freeze that promised relief from rising prices. Newspapers splashed headlines like "NIXON takes action to defend the dollar." The White House carefully framed it as strength, not surrender. But behind the triumphal images, something fundamental had changed: money itself. In the weeks following the announcement, the psychological adjustment began. Foreign governments realized that their hoards of dollars, once guaranteed claims on U.S. gold, were now simply paper assets. They could no longer demand anything tangible in exchange. The privilege of printing the world's reserve currency had transformed into a power based entirely on trust. America had defaulted in all but name. For everyday citizens, the change wasn't immediately visible. They still used the same bills, bought groceries with the same notes, collected paychecks with the same symbols, but prices began creeping upward. Gold, once frozen at $35 an ounce, leapt to nearly $45 within months and kept climbing. That reflected not just inflation, but the market's realization that the anchor was gone. Internationally, allies felt betrayed. West Germany called the move economic warfare. France's finance minister compared it to a declaration of independence from responsibility, yet none could do much about it. They needed access to American markets and credit, and soon, as oil prices rose and debts mounted, the world would need dollars more than ever. Ironically, by breaking its promise, the United States strengthened its currency's dominance. The dollar became indispensable precisely because no alternative existed. Within Washington, a new sense of possibility emerged. Without the gold constraint, the Federal Reserve could adjust the money supply freely. Politicians realized they could finance deficits without shipping gold overseas. Debt, once seen as dangerous, became a tool. The age of fiat money, and with it, modern inflationary economics, had begun. The dollar no longer represented a fixed weight of metal. It represented faith in a government's ability to maintain stability through policy alone. Not everyone celebrated. Older economists warned that removing discipline from money would unleash cycles of inflation and instability. One senator remarked that future generations might look back on this night as the great monetary leap into the unknown. But there was no way back. Gold convertibility was gone forever. That Sunday night broadcast lasted just 15 minutes. When the cameras switched off, Nixon smiled faintly, certain he had saved the economy and perhaps his presidency. In a technical sense, he had. Panic subsided, the dollar stabilized for a while, and the public rallied behind him. Yet historically, this was the moment the world's monetary architecture quietly cracked apart. The disciplined order of Bretton Woods was replaced by a system built on confidence and convenience. Over the next few years, countries one by one abandoned fixed exchange rates. By 1973, all major currencies floated freely. Inflation surged across continents, and the price of every essential commodity began to swing wildly. The old promise of stability had been replaced by constant motion. And through it all, the US dollar, now detached from gold, remained at the center, not because it was solid, but because everyone needed it to keep the game going. In hindsight, that Sunday night was both an ending and a beginning. It was the funeral of gold-backed money and the birth of financial faith as the world's true reserve. From that moment on, the US could print, borrow, and spend on a scale never before possible. The limits of metal had been replaced by the limits of imagination. The system hadn't collapsed, it had transformed, and every modern crisis still echoes that transformation. The fallout, panic, inflation, and chaos. When Nixon finished speaking that Sunday night, the world's financial order entered free fall. By Monday morning, panic had spread across trading floors from London to Tokyo. Currency exchanges saw their busiest days in memory as dealers rushed to guess what the temporary suspension really meant. Everyone suspected the obvious. The United States had defaulted on its promise. The anchors were gone. The era of stable exchange rates was over. Within weeks, the Smithsonian Agreement tried to patch things up. Representatives from the Group of 10, the leading industrial powers, met in Washington that December and agreed to revalue their currencies. The dollar would be devalued by about 8.5% against gold, and others would adjust accordingly. On paper, the system lived on. In practice, it was already crumbling. Speculators, smelling opportunity, bet heavily against fixed rates. Nations that once prided themselves on stability began running out of reserves trying to defend their pegs. By 1973, the Smithsonian framework was abandoned, and currencies were allowed to float freely for the first time in modern history. For ordinary people, the consequences were swift and confusing. Prices began to rise everywhere, but especially in the United States. The cost of groceries, housing, gas, and wages entered a tug-of-war that no one seemed able to control. Economists coined a new word for what followed: stagflation, a painful combination of stagnant growth and high inflation that defied conventional wisdom. The logic of the old world no longer applied. Under the gold standard, printing more money would have drained reserves and forced discipline. Now, there was no external break. Governments could issue currency endlessly and hope their citizens wouldn't lose faith. By 1974, US inflation had jumped to double digits. The cost of a loaf of bread doubled in a few short years. Public trust began to crack. News anchors spoke of a cost of living crisis, while politicians blamed foreign oil and greedy corporations. In reality, the removal of gold had removed psychological restraint. Leaders found it easier to paper over problems than confront them. The economy was learning what it meant to live on promises. Abroad, shockwaves were even more severe. Many nations had pegged their money to the dollar, assuming it would remain stable. When the peg collapsed, their economies lost balance overnight. Exchange rates swung violently. Some currencies sank 20 or 30% in a matter of months. Trade contracts denominated in dollars suddenly became far more expensive. Developing countries that had borrowed heavily in those same dollars saw their debts balloon. A silent financial chain reaction rippled through every continent. In Latin America, the first tremors appeared in the early 197s as imported inflation hit consumer goods. Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, all tied closely to U.S. trade, watched their purchasing power erode. African nations felt it too. The price of imported machinery soared, while earnings from commodity exports became unpredictable. Floating exchange rates turned global trade into a casino. For countries still struggling to industrialize, the volatility was brutal. Meanwhile, inside Western capitals, policymakers scrambled for explanations. At the International Monetary Fund, experts debated whether the end of Bretton Woods had unleashed a one-time shock or a permanent change. Most central bankers quickly realized there was no going back. Each nation would now have to manage its currency independently, using interest rates and market intervention instead of gold. The age of managed exchange rates and coordinated stability was gone. The irony was that even as faith in fixed systems collapsed, the dollar itself didn't. In fact, it remained the primary instrument through which global trade was conducted. Oil contracts, shipping insurance, and international banking were still denominated in dollars. The U.S. was large enough and its markets deep enough that investors continued to rely on it. The very country that caused the turmoil benefited most from it. Others joked bitterly that the dollar is our currency, but your problem. At home, American workers experienced déjà vu. Wages were adjusted upward to keep pace with rising prices, but every gain was erased by higher costs of living. Businesses raised prices preemptively, expecting future inflation. A feedback loop emerged. People spent quickly before their money lost value, pushing prices even higher. In 1973, the oil crisis struck, turning anxiety into chaos. OPEC's embargo sent crude prices skyrocketing, which fed inflation around the world. Lines formed at gas stations, and a sense of helplessness spread. Central banks tried drastic measures. The U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates repeatedly, choking borrowing and plunging the economy into recession. European countries experimented with wage freezes and credit controls. Developing nations negotiated emergency loans to service debts that had suddenly doubled in real terms. The structure of global finance, the same one that had seemed eternal only a few years earlier, looked unrecognizable. And yet, amid the confusion, one reality emerged. Every country still needed access to U.S. dollars. Whether to pay for oil, service loans, or shore up reserves, the world couldn't escape the greenback. That dependence gave Washington an extraordinary advantage. Despite causing the instability, America became the center of the new monetary universe by default. The rest of the world had no choice but to orbit its currency. This paradox, chaos outside, dominance within, defined the decade. The dollar, stripped of gold, now drew strength from global necessity. The U.S. could run persistent trade deficits without collapsing. It could print money to fund domestic spending, knowing foreign nations would hold those dollars in their reserves. Instead of gold bars, trust itself became America's greatest export. However, this newfound power came at a moral and economic cost. Inflation eroded savings. Fixed-income workers lost ground as rents and essentials outpaced paychecks. In developing countries, debt piled up faster than governments could repay. By the late 197s, entire regions were trapped in cycles of borrowing and devaluation. This was the hidden legacy of the Nixon Shock, a world addicted to a currency no longer anchored in anything tangible. Investors began hedging their bets, buying commodities, property, and especially gold again, which soared above $800 an ounce by 198. It was as if people instinctively sought refuge in the very metal their leaders had declared obsolete. The faith that sustained fiat money faced its first true test. Governments responded with austerity and promises of restraint, but citizens everywhere understood the lesson. Money could lose value faster than anyone expected. Throughout this turmoil, questions circulated quietly in academic circles and boardrooms alike. Could a monetary system purely based on trust endure? Would inflation spiral out of control? And if not gold, what could serve as a new anchor? The eventual answer would come not from metal or ideology, but from something else entirely: oil. As the 197s drew to a close, the United States sought a way to restore demand for its money, to recreate the stability gold once provided. The solution emerged in the deserts of the Middle East. A series of secret negotiations with Saudi Arabia would soon bind the dollar to the world's most sought-after commodity. The currency that had lost its glitter would gain a new kind of backing: energy instead of treasure. That arrangement would become known as the Petrodollar System, and it would rescue the dollar's supremacy just when it seemed most vulnerable. But before the resurrection came the reckoning. The early 1970s had revealed how fragile the global economy could become when its foundation was trust alone. People had watched savings erode and currencies convulse, all because of one Sunday night decision. Now the chaos was giving way to comprehension. The next chapter in the dollar's story wouldn't be about panic, but about adaptation: how nations, markets, and policymakers rebuilt order after the shock. The crisis had exposed the weakness of a system built on faith. What followed would show how that same faith was re-engineered into a new, lasting framework for global power. The petrodollar deal. By 1974, a strange contradiction defined the post-gold world. The dollar was technically weaker than ever, yet more essential than ever. Nations no longer trusted it as a promise of value, but they couldn't run their economies without it. Every barrel of imported oil, every shipment of machinery, every bond issue still denominated in US dollars. The global economy, starved for a new anchor, began to revolve around the one thing more universally desired than gold: energy. The oil crisis of 1973 had cracked open the door. After the Arab-Israeli war that October, members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led by Saudi Arabia, announced an embargo against nations supporting Israel. Supply plummeted, prices quadrupled, and the Western world reeled. Lines at gas stations wrapped for miles. Inflation, already rampant, exploded. Oil had become not just a commodity, but a weapon, and whoever controlled it could shape the fate of currency. For Washington, the timing was especially dangerous. The US dollar, stripped of gold only 2 years earlier, was still struggling to prove its worth. A collapse in energy supplies threatened both the economy and the perception of American power. Meanwhile, oil-producing nations were suddenly rich beyond measure. Saudi Arabia's revenues soared from under $1 billion in the mid-196s to tens of billions by 1975. The imbalance was staggering. Dollars were flooding into Riyadh faster than the kingdom could spend them. The question was what to do with all that money and in what currency to hold it. Behind the scenes, US officials feared an even more existential threat. If OPEC decided to price oil in another currency, say the British pound or even gold itself, the dollar's global status could unravel overnight. Demand for US currency would collapse, interest rates would spike, and Washington would lose its most powerful economic advantage: the ability to finance domestic spending with money the world depended on. Keeping oil priced in dollars wasn't just convenient. It was critical to America's survival as a financial superpower. Enter Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a man fluent in power politics. In late 1973 and early 1974, he and Treasury officials began quiet negotiations with Saudi Arabia, the undisputed leader of OPEC. The offer was simple but seismic. If Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in US dollars, the United States would guarantee the kingdom's security, supply advanced weapons, and provide avenues for investing its enormous surpluses in safe American assets. In June 1974, the deal was formalized. The United States and Saudi Arabia created a joint commission for economic cooperation. On paper, it focused on development projects, roads, education, defense. In reality, it set in motion the machinery of a new monetary order. The US would recycle Saudi oil wealth back into its own financial system. In exchange, oil, the world's most traded commodity, would carry a dollar price tag for the foreseeable future. Other OPEC members soon followed suit. By 1975, the group had officially adopted dollar-based pricing for all exports. The petrodollar was born. From that moment on, if a country wanted to buy oil, it first needed US dollars. And to get dollars, it had to trade with the United States or borrow from its banks. The global demand for oil thus automatically generated global demand for the American currency that priced it. The genius, or cynicism, of the system was that it required no gold, no formal treaty enforcement, just necessity. Energy fueled the world, and the dollar became the ticket to access it. The cascade effects were rapid and profound. Oil exporters like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates deposited their enormous profits, petrodollars, into Western banks, especially in New York and London. These banks, suddenly flush with liquidity, sought new places to lend. The result was a wave of international loans to developing nations, particularly in Latin America and Africa. To poorer countries, it looked like a lifeline, cheap dollars to finance growth. In reality, it was the beginning of a dangerous dependency. Inside Washington, the new arrangement solved several problems at once. It stabilized the dollar's value, guaranteed external demand, and funded ongoing trade deficits without depleting reserves. Oil consumption around the world kept the cycle alive. Nations needed dollars to buy energy, spent those dollars, and then recycled them back into U.S. financial markets. The more the world used oil, the stronger the dollar's gravitational pull became. Saudi Arabia benefited enormously. Its coffers overflowed with oil revenues, and American military cooperation fortified the monarchy's security. Defense contracts worth billions linked the two countries in mutual interest. U.S. multinationals helped build cities, airports, and infrastructure across the Desert Kingdom. In return, Saudi investment poured into U.S. Treasury bonds, silently financing American deficit. The relationship became a cornerstone of global geopolitics, blending economics and defense in a way no treaty had before. But the system was not without costs. For non-oil producing nations, the dollar's resurrection through petroleum purchases meant their import bills soared. As oil prices spiked and interest rates adjusted, countries that needed to buy energy found themselves in chronic deficit. They borrowed dollars to pay for fuel, only to owe more when the currency appreciated. Petrodollar solved America's inflation problem, but exported volatility to everyone else. Meanwhile, financial markets changed forever. The flood of dollar deposits outside the U.S., known as Eurodollars, created a parallel global banking network beyond direct American regulation. London became the center of this system, intermediating trillions in loans and recycling oil wealth through private banks. Money flowed faster and further than ever before, detached from physical trade and increasingly speculative. The era of globalized finance had begun, not by design, but as a side effect of a diplomatic bargain born out of crisis. By the late 197s, the petrodollar arrangement appeared unshakable. Oil prices were high, the dollar was in constant demand, and the U.S. enjoyed unmatched leverage. It could impose sanctions, grant aid, or extend credit merely by controlling the flow of its currency. Nations understood that challenging the system could mean isolation from both energy markets and global banking. Economic power had replaced gold as the ultimate form of coercion. Yet beneath the apparent stability lay delicate mutual dependence. The U.S. needed Saudi Arabia to keep oil priced in dollars. Saudi Arabia needed U.S. security guarantees to deter regional threats. Each side held leverage over the other, and both understood that their alliance was transactional, not sentimental. On occasion, tensions surfaced, particularly during debates over Israel or arms deals, but the cash flow always continued. Oil shipments one way, dollars the other. This quiet pact reshaped more than just energy. It defined the next half-century of global politics. Petrodollars funded Western deficits, fueled foreign investment, and underwrote entire waves of credit expansion. They also entrenched a new kind of global hierarchy, one where the reserve currency was no longer backed by metal or productivity, but by an international habit no one dared break. For average citizens worldwide, the implications were invisible yet immense. Every time oil prices jumped, inflation followed. Every time the U.S. Federal Reserve changed interest rates, the ripple reached far-off economies tethered by oil and debt. The world had effectively created a single financial ecosystem centered on one currency and one commodity. The irony was striking. An economic system built to escape the constraints of gold had replaced one dependence with another. Instead of a metal buried in vaults, the dollar's value now rested on oil flowing through pipelines and tankers. Stability depended not on geology, but geopolitics, wars, alliances, and the goodwill of a handful of producers. The same vulnerability that had haunted Bretton Woods lingered, disguised in crude. Still, in the mid-197s, few questioned the arrangement. Business was booming, credit was abundant, and the memory of 1971's shock seemed to fade. The dollar, reborn through oil, looked indestructible once again, but this new equilibrium carried hidden fragility. It made global prosperity hinge on faith in two things: continued demand for fossil fuels and America's ability to honor its unspoken promise of monetary leadership. History, of course, would test both beliefs. In the decades that followed, debt crises, recessions, and shifting alliances would reveal the costs of a world run on petrodollars. But for now, the system worked. The United States had reinvented its currency's foundation, no longer a claim on gold, but on energy and trust. The dollar had died in 1971, yes, but in the oil-soaked sands of the 197s, it was reborn. The ripple effect, the developing world. While politicians and bankers in Washington debated inflation charts, the real shock hit thousands of miles away. Across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, families watch prices explode, savings vanish, and government plans fall apart overnight. Nations that had tied their currencies to the dollar for stability and borrowed in that same dollar to build roads, factories, and schools suddenly found themselves chained to a currency they couldn't control. The United States had cut its link to gold, but developing nations paid the price in hunger, debt, and lost decades of growth. At first, things looked bright. Petrodollars flooded global banks, and Western lenders went shopping for developing markets to pour them into. Money rained down in the form of cheap loans, supposedly the ticket to modernization. Mexico, Brazil, Nigeria, leaders everywhere saw a chance to finally catch up. Highways, power plants, factories, the promise of prosperity was printed in US dollars. The loans came easy, the repayment terms impossible. Everyone believed the dollar was safe, neutral, eternal. They were wrong. But the new floating exchange rate world quickly erased that illusion. Currencies that had once moved in lockstep with the dollar began to slide. Inflation, spreading outward from the United States, seeped into their economies through imports. A country could wake up to find that yesterday's debt suddenly cost more in local terms as its currency depreciated. The money borrowed for progress turned into a millstone. Take Mexico during the mid-197s. Flush with oil discoveries and easy credit, the government borrowed from international banks at what looked like manageable rates. Those debts were in dollars, while its revenue came mostly in pesos. When oil prices dipped and the peso weakened, the cost of servicing foreign loans skyrocketed. Within a decade, Mexico was owing more than it earned in exports. The phrase, balance of payments crisis, became a polite way of describing national insolvency. Nigeria mirrored that trajectory. Its oil boom in the 197s filled state coffers, and lenders lined up to offer dollar-denominated funds for roads, refineries, and new cities. When oil prices fell in the 198s and the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates to squeeze domestic inflation, Nigeria's repayment costs exploded. Every slight uptick in U.S. rates rippled instantly through developing economies. Their development budgets evaporated into interest payments. This was no coincidence, it was baked into the system. The new dollar world tied every economy to U.S. policy. To buy oil, to trade, to survive, developing nations had to earn or borrow American currency. Each borrowed dollar was a leash, each loan a dependency. When the U.S. Federal Reserve hiked rates under Paul Volcker in 1979 to strangle its own inflation, the pain ricocheted outward. The same policy that cooled prices in New York triggered debt crises in Lagos, Sao Paulo, and Manila, the so-called Third World Debt Crisis. For Washington, it was adjustment. For the developing world, it was collapse. Interest rates in the U.S. rose above 20%. Capital retreated from risky markets. Within months, Latin American economies imploded. Brazil's external debt doubled between 1978 and 1982 purely due to interest rate shifts and currency changes. Argentina defaulted. Mexico teetered on the brink until a series of emergency packages from the IMF arrived. In Africa, Zambia and Ghana entered cycles of inflation and devaluation that would last decades. It was as if Washington's domestic medicine, a painful cure for its own inflation, had become poison abroad. At the same time, commodity exporters suffered from another side effect of the Fiat system: price volatility. Floating exchange rates meant that copper, coffee, cocoa, and tin, all staples of developing world exports, fluctuated wildly in dollar terms. A bumper crop or a minor recession in the West could have export earnings overnight. Governments built around steady commodity income suddenly couldn't pay public workers or import food. Some turned to printing their own currencies, which only worsened inflation. The social cost was immense but largely invisible outside those borders. In Peru and Bolivia, hyperinflation shredded savings. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, civil services collapsed as foreign reserves vanished. Development plans written under the assumption of steady exchange rates looked like fantasy. Each wave of devaluation made imported medicine, fuel, and machinery more expensive, eroding living standards further. A generation came of age equating globalization with austerity. Textbooks called it an external shock. For families, it was far simpler. Layoffs, hunger, blackouts. Parents chose between school fees and food, between buying medicine or fuel. Inflation devoured wages. Savings turned to dust. The same faith that propped up the dollar translated into despair in countries that had believed in it most. The 1980s debt crises weren't just economic events. They were human disasters born from one Sunday night in 1971. International institutions stepped in with solutions framed as rescue packages. The IMF prescribed structural adjustment, cut subsidies, privatize industries, open markets, and stabilize the currency. In practice, this meant deep spending cuts just as citizens faced unemployment and soaring prices. Currencies were often pegged again, ironically, back to the very dollar that had caused their turmoil, supposedly to restore stability. For many countries, stability never returned. Meanwhile, multinational corporations headquartered in the West thrived in the new environment. Floating currencies made it easier for them to shift profits across borders, hedge risks, and buy distressed assets in struggling nations at bargain prices. The rise of global finance after the Nixon Shock consolidated wealth in a few corporate and banking centers, even as it eroded sovereignty elsewhere. The flow of capital that once promised development increasingly resembled extraction. A quiet hierarchy emerged. At the top sat the United States, issuing the currency everyone needed. Below were the industrial powers managing their own floats. And at the bottom lay the developing world, debtor nations whose fortunes rose and fell with every twitch of the Federal Reserve's interest rate graph. The system's design ensured that shocks in Washington reverberated instantly through Sao Paulo, Lagos, and Manila. Some countries tried to fight back. Brazil experimented with partial indexation, linking wages and contracts to inflation to protect citizens from price swings. Others, like Malaysia and South Korea, blended market reforms with strategic protectionism to shield domestic industries. But even their successes underscored dependence. Their exports still required dollar settlement, and their central banks still held American securities as reserves. The fiat world left no pure escape. By the early 199s, economists started speaking of a lost decade for Latin America and parts of Africa, 10 years of stagnation born not merely of mismanagement, but of systemic imbalance. What began in Washington as a push for flexibility had translated globally into a rigid pattern of dependence. Developing nations learned that stability in the rich world often meant instability everywhere else. The irony was cruel. When Bretton Woods ended, American officials justified it as modernization, a freer, more adaptable system. For wealthy nations with advanced financial institutions, that freedom meant opportunity. For poorer ones, it meant vulnerability. The end of gold had democratized volatility. Yet, amid the hardship, new awareness took root. Some leaders began to question the wisdom of anchoring their futures to a foreign currency. Regional blocs explored local currency trade agreements. The idea of monetary sovereignty returned to policy debates. Decades later, that skepticism would resurface in experiments with digital currencies and calls to de-dollarize. But in the 197s and 198s, such ideas were barely whispers. Survival came first. By the time the dust settled, the world had learned a bitter truth. The dollar's stability was built on someone else's instability. Developing nations paid for America's freedom with their futures, devalued currencies, soaring debt, and dreams deferred for generations. The petrodollar kept the global engine humming, but it ran on the exhaustion of those least able to pay the price. In the wake of those crises, confidence itself became a scarce resource. Citizens who watched their currencies collapse learned to distrust official promises. Inflation wasn't theory, it was daily life. For millions, the lesson of the post-gold era was simple and bitter. When money is only faith, faith can fail you overnight. How fiat money changed everything. When the United States broke its promise to redeem dollars for gold, it didn't just rewrite its own laws, it rewired how money itself worked. The move created a world where paper, backed only by confidence, replaced physical reserves as the ultimate store of value. Overnight, the global financial system transformed from an age of restraint to an era defined by possibility and danger. In the years immediately after 1971, governments and central banks faced a puzzle: how to run economies when their currencies no longer had a fixed anchor. Under the gold standard, policymakers had clear limits. If they printed too much money, gold would leave the country and force correction. Without that discipline, they needed new rules. What emerged was a modern experiment: let money float, manage it with interest rates, and trust institutions instead of metal to maintain value. This shift turned central banks into the ultimate referees of economic life. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the Bundesbank assumed enormous power to steer economies through monetary policy. Instead of defending a gold peg, they now targeted inflation rates, credit growth, and employment levels. The lever was interest rates: raise them to cool an overheated economy, lower them to encourage borrowing and spending. It was flexible, dynamic, and deeply psychological. For everyday people, the change was subtle at first. A dollar still looked like a dollar, coins still clinked in pockets, but underneath, its meaning had changed completely. No law now promised that those bills could be traded for anything of tangible worth. Their value depended on belief in a government's competence to manage supply and a population's willingness to accept them as payment. Money had become a story everyone agreed to tell together. This new age of fiat currency accelerated innovation. Freed from the physical limits of gold, nations could finance big projects, stimulate recessions away, and respond to crises with breathtaking speed. In the 198s and 199s, policymakers embraced this flexibility with zeal. Economists coined phrases like demand management and monetary easing. When economies slowed, central banks simply injected liquidity, cut rates, buy bonds, and flood markets with credit. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of being reactive to the world's supply of gold, governments could shape reality through policy. The results were mixed but dramatic. In developed countries, growth became smoother on paper. Recessions were shorter, recoveries faster. Credit expanded. Consumers borrowed easily for homes, cars, businesses. Stocks soared as money became plentiful. In developing nations, cheap global liquidity often translated into waves of speculative capital, fueling booms that sometimes turned to busts. The rhythms of finance began to replace the rhythms of production. Yet a deeper transformation took place in how people understood value itself. For centuries, wealth had been measured in things you could touch: land, minerals, precious metal, goods. Now wealth existed increasingly as digits on ledgers and screens. Trust replaced tangibility. The phrase "full faith and credit" shifted from a ceremonial assurance to the bedrock of the global economy. Paper money's worth depended on confidence that someone else would accept it tomorrow at roughly the same value. That dependence on belief carried both elegance and risk. As long as people trusted their institutions, fiat money could function indefinitely. But confidence, once shaken, spread faster than any rumor. Inflation wasn't just an economic phenomenon, it was a psychological one. If citizens thought prices would rise, they spent faster, pushing them higher in a self-fulfilling loop. The metal standard's physical constraint had been replaced by a behavioral one: faith. For governments, the temptation was obvious. If prosperity could be prolonged by printing, why stop? Politicians of every ideology discovered that expanding money supply could boost short-term growth and help win elections. Budget deficits no longer meant immediate penalties in lost gold or confidence abroad. They simply meant more debt issued in the same national currency. The United States, for example, shifted from being the world's largest creditor to its largest debtor without losing reserve status. Foreign nations still needed dollars to trade, so they bought American debt willingly. Fiat money made that paradox possible. The social impact was profound. Debt became the oxygen of modern life. Families took mortgages spanning decades. Corporations financed mergers and buyouts with borrowed funds. Governments funded welfare states, wars, and infrastructure by issuing bonds. The line between money and credit blurred until, for all practical purposes, they became the same thing. The label money supply now included not only cash, but also deposits, loans, and securities. All forms of confidence circulating in widening circles. Economically, the fiat age fostered creativity alongside vulnerability. A local crisis could spread globally in minutes. Financial markets multiplied into networks so fast that central banks spent more time managing expectations than managing actual resources. The great crises that followed, the 1987 stock crash, the 1997 Asian currency meltdown, and later the 2008 financial collapse, were not isolated failures, but logical byproducts of a system designed to stretch trust as far as possible. Supporters argued this elasticity was strength. The ability to create liquidity on demand prevented deep depressions like those of the 193s. When disaster struck, governments could stimulate rather than collapse. Critics countered that each rescue required ever larger injections, setting a precedent of dependency. The world had learned to treat central banks as guardians not just of stability, but of prosperity itself. When growth faltered, investors looked not to factories or workers, but to monetary policy announcements. This psychological shift redefined prosperity. In a fiat world, optimism became an economic input. Confidence indexes could move markets. A speech from a central banker could add or erase billions in minutes. The economy transformed into a feedback loop between perception and reality. The old question, how much gold backs this money, was replaced by how much trust backs this system. Throughout the 199s and early 200s, globalization magnified this interdependence. The fall of trade barriers and digital finance extended the dollar's reach farther than Bretton Woods planners ever imagined. Every transaction linked to oil, trade, or credit default swaps relied on shared belief in the durability of paper promises. The same traits that made fiat money adaptable, speed, quantity, reliance on confidence, made it fragile under stress. Whenever that faith faltered, inflation reminded people of the cost. Over decades, the purchasing power of major currencies eroded quietly. What a dollar bought in 1971 now required more than 6. Wages rose, yes, but unevenly. Wealth concentration increased as those closest to financial assets benefited most from cheap credit. The fiat system had democratized spending, but not prosperity. Still, even skeptics acknowledged its strange resilience. Every time confidence slipped, a crisis here, a crash there, the same pattern unfolded. Panic, stimulus, recovery, and renewed faith. Gold rallied briefly, discussions of reform surfaced, and then the world returned to business as usual. The convenience of fiat money outweighed its contradictions. After all, no one wanted to trade their debit card for bullion. The most surprising outcome of all was psychological peace with abstraction. Generations grew up never questioning why money worked. The link between currency and physical wealth vanished from collective memory. What once required vast vaults now existed as electronic signals in reserve accounts. A financial system that had seemed temporary after 1971 became invisible background reality until crises made it visible again. By the early 21st century, the dividing line between economics and psychology was gone. Markets reacted not just to numbers, but to moods. Interest rates near zero became normal. Printing trillions to rescue the economy during recessions or pandemics became policy orthodoxy. The gold standard's ghost occasionally returned in public debate, yet most accepted that fiat money was less a flaw than an evolutionary step, one fitting a digital world. And through it all, the lesson of 1971 lingered quietly beneath every transaction. What gives money its worth isn't a mineral, a vault, or even a government decree, it's agreement. Fiat currency replaced scarcity with story, transforming global finance into an act of collective imagination. That imagination has powered half a century of growth, speculation, and innovation, and left humanity dependent on its own belief to sustain value itself. Then versus now, the vanishing dollar. 50 years after Nixon cut the dollar's link to gold, the numbers tell a story more vivid than any policy debate. In 1970, the average American home cost about $23,000. Today, it's more than $400,000. A gallon of gas that once sold for 36 cents now costs around $4. A dozen eggs that cost 60 cents approach $4. The same dollar that once filled a grocery bag now buys a single apple and maybe a pack of gum. This isn't just inflation, it's the visible fingerprint of that 1971 decision. When money stopped being tied to something finite, its supply began to stretch with every new crisis, war, or rescue plan. Each generation watched prices creep a little higher until the change became invisible, normalized. A dollar's purchasing power today is worth barely 15 cents of its 1971 counterpart. What was once a symbol of strength has quietly eroded year after year through the simple law of arithmetic. Print more, buy less. For older generations, the transformation is tangible. Savings that once funded retirements now barely cover medical bills. For younger ones, the cost of housing and education feels like another currency altogether. Every price tag carries ghost numbers, the unspoken exchange between gold-backed certainty and fiat flexibility. Yet this isn't just an American phenomenon. The entire world, pegged to the dollar for trade and energy, absorbed the same effect. Oil exporters, manufacturers, and debtors all adjusted costs upward as dollars expanded. The result, a global rise in nominal wealth but a decline in real purchasing power. The world grew richer on paper but thinner in substance. Visually, the shift is startling. Imagine a shopping cart rolling through decades, items vanishing as prices rise. Gasoline, bread, tuition, housing, each doubling, tripling, quadrupling in cost. What disappeared wasn't value, it was stability. The temporary suspension Nixon announced became a permanent redefinition of money itself. Still, understanding this change isn't about nostalgia for gold coins or simpler times. It's about recognizing how policy decisions echo through ordinary lives. The 1971 break may have rescued the dollar short-term, but it also rewired what that dollar means. Every paycheck, savings account, and national budget since has been part of that same experiment in elastic value. The next time you glance at an old photo, cars lined up at a 25-cent gas station, a diner menu offering coffee for a dime, remember, those prices were built on promises once backed by metal. The prices we live with now are built on faith, and that faith traces back to one quiet Sunday when the world's money changed forever. The dollar's invincibility myth. For decades, Americans grew up believing the dollar could never fail. It wasn't just money, it was identity. Movies showed villains demanding ransom in US dollars. Tourists flashed it like a universal key. When other currencies collapsed, people fled to greenbacks as if they were lifeboats. The idea of the dollar falling apart felt as absurd as gravity stopping. But that belief was inherited from a world that no longer existed, a world of gold anchors, disciplined ledgers, and post-war certainty. The very thing that made the dollar flexible after 1971 also made it fragile, trust without tether. By the late 20th century, the myth of the dollar's invincibility had hardened into cultural instinct. Textbooks framed it as the world's reserve currency by divine logic, not political design. Few remembered that this stability came not from metal or mathematics, but from habit and geopolitics. Every oil contract, airline purchase, and global debt payment kept the system running only because no one wanted to ask what held it together. As long as goods moved and soldiers guarded sea lanes, faith remained self-fulfilling. Inside America, that same myth seeped into domestic confidence. The U.S. government could borrow endlessly while Congress debated ceiling after ceiling. Voters assumed deficits were abstract, technical numbers unconnected to daily life. Inflation was something that happened to other countries. Even after the stagflation of the 197s, faith recovered quickly once wages rose again. The economy grew, memories faded, and digital numbers replaced physical cash. The detachment felt normal, yet the quiet erosion had begun. Since 1971, the purchasing power of $1 shrank by roughly 85%. What a worker earned in 197 would buy only a fraction today, even with raises. Savings accounts barely outpaced inflation, while asset prices, homes, stocks, education ballooned. The myth persisted because the decline was slow, incremental, disguised as progress. A loaf of bread costing more each decade didn't feel like a currency collapse. It felt like time. Politicians capitalized on this illusion. Printing money or increasing spending no longer triggered immediate panic. When recessions struck, stimulus checks and lower interest rates seemed to fix them. Each success reinforced the belief that the dollar could absorb any shock. In crisis after crisis, the 1987 crash, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 meltdown, Washington responded the same way. Create more dollars, inject liquidity, and wait for confidence to return. It always did, at least temporarily. The repetition became ritual. The 2008 financial crisis revealed both the dollar's dominance and its dependence. Banks around the world hoarded it as fear spread. Nations lined up to receive Federal Reserve swap lines, essentially lifelines in green ink. Commentators proclaimed again that the dollar was untouchable, but the rescue itself exposed the system's vulnerability. Stability required infinite creation of the very currency whose value everyone claimed to trust. Confidence could be manufactured, but only by ever larger doses. Then came the pandemic decades later. Trillions of new dollars entered circulation within months, conjured to prevent collapse during lockdowns. For a while it worked. The economy bounced back faster than anyone predicted. Yet prices soon soared, supply chains jammed, and inflation returned in headlines for the first time in a generation. The dollar hadn't failed, but its supremacy suddenly felt less divine. People asked again what gave it value beyond promise and habit. Globally, new powers were learning to test those assumptions. China expanded trade in yuan. Russia and partners settled energy deals outside the dollar system. Saudi Arabia, once the foundation of the petrodollar order, began hinting at accepting other currencies for oil after the 202's agreement's quiet expiration. Each move seemed minor in isolation. Together, they signaled an era of choice. The dollar was still preeminent, but no longer alone at the table. Culturally, Americans remained insulated from the symbolism of these shifts. The dollar logo, bold green ink, the pyramid, the eagle, retained magical authority. To question its permanence felt almost disloyal. But under that design lay a simple truth. Since leaving gold, the dollars might came from policies, not physics. Its durability depended on global faith that the United States would remain solvent, stable, and militarily unmatched. Confidence rested as much on aircraft carriers as on spreadsheets. When economists warn that money is debt, they mean exactly this. Most dollars in existence are promises created when banks issue loans and erased when debts are repaid. The expanding cycle of credit gives the illusion of endless growth, yet ties every household and government to perpetual borrowing. The dollar's invincibility narrative hides that dependency. A stable currency backed by nothing must continually justify itself through motion, trade, lending, and investment. Stop the flow, and belief wavers. The myth persists partly because no clear alternative exists. The euro lacks unified political backing. The yuan remains managed by a single-party state. Gold is inconvenient, cryptocurrencies volatile, so markets keep defaulting to the familiar. But familiarity is not the same as immortality. Empires before Rome and after it believed their currencies eternal, until they weren't. Debasement doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly through diluted trust. Debt became the most visible measure of this fragility. In 1971, total U.S. federal debt stood around $400 billion. By the 202's, it exceeded $30 trillion. Yet interest rates remained historically low for much of that expansion because global demand for treasuries stayed insatiable. Investors still saw them as the safest place to park capital, precisely because the U.S. could print the means to repay. Paradoxically, the same power that ensured repayment guaranteed dilution. Safety equaled slow loss. The psychological comfort of the dollar also relied on shared memory. After half a century of relative stability, few alive remembered bank runs or currency reform. Digital convenience replaced tactile scarcity. With money invisible and instantaneous, fear became abstract. As long as transactions cleared, faith endured. But if inflation lingers or another crisis forces drastic printing, that collective calm could shift suddenly. Confidence collapsing not from insolvency but realization. Throughout history, reserve currencies outlive their origins by decades, supported by inertia and network effects. The British pound enjoyed empire-wide dominance long after Britain's economic peak. The US dollar may follow a similar path, gradually slipping from supremacy to plurality. That transition, if it comes, will unfold not with a crash but with competing systems, regional reserves, digital tokens, and multipolar finance, sharing what was once monopoly. The legend of invulnerability will erode slowly, quietly, until no one can pinpoint when it ended. Still, myths die hard, especially profitable ones. As of now, the global economy remains wired to dollars, oil traded in them, debts issued in them, savings calculated through them. Even skeptics depend on the system they critique. Every central bank stockpiles dollars just in case. Every market panic proves the same point. The world still trusts the myth more than its alternative. The true collapse, if it comes, won't be economic first. It will be psychological, when belief finally finds a new object. Until then, the dollar endures as paradox, a currency simultaneously mortal and indispensable. It represents the United States' greatest advantage and its greatest temptation, the power to create endless purchasing power without immediate penalty. But each new round of debt, each fresh crisis patched with liquidity, stretches the story thinner. The question is not whether the dollar can fall, but whether global faith can adapt when it changes again. The invincible dollar died in 1971. We just learned to live inside its afterlife. The new age of currency power. Half a century after Nixon's 15-minute broadcast, the world's monetary map looks unrecognizable yet strangely familiar. The dollar, once tied to gold and then to oil, now lives in a digital bloodstream that moves faster than any physical resource ever could. But for the first time since the 194s, that dominance feels contested. The pillars that held it up, petroleum, trust, and habit, are shifting beneath it. One key tremor hit quietly in 2024 when the original U.S.-Saudi petrodollar agreement expired. No formal crisis erupted, oil still flowed and payments continued, but symbolically it marked the end of a secret chain binding crude to green ink. Saudi Arabia began exploring transactions in other currencies, including China's yuan and Europe's euro. For decades, even whispers of such a move would have unsettled markets. This time, markets merely blinked. That calm explained everything. The monopoly of the dollar had softened into negotiation. Across the globe, new financial experiments were taking shape. Central banks from Beijing to Brasilia launched digital versions of their national currencies, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, intended to bypass the traditional dollar-based payment system. China's digital yuan led the charge, linking tens of millions of users through mobile apps integrated directly with the central bank. It wasn't about convenience alone, it was about sovereignty. The more trade Beijing could settle in its own units, the less dependent it became on clearing payments through New York or London. In parallel, technology companies and private developers built cryptocurrencies and stablecoins designed to move money without governments at all. Bitcoin, created back in 2009 as a rebellion against fiat money, matured into an asset class that central banks could no longer ignore. Nations like El Salvador adopted it experimentally, others regulated it cautiously. But its existence alone proved that digital scarcity could challenge state control. For policymakers educated under the Bretton Woods mindset, this was heresy. For younger generations raised on apps and tokens, it looked normal. Meanwhile, the balance of trade was drifting eastward. China surpassed the United States as the largest goods exporter years earlier, and its Belt and Road initiative stitched together dozens of partners who began settling debts in regional currencies. Russia, facing Western sanctions, rerouted energy sales to Asia, accepting yuan and rupees instead of dollars. Tiny percentages at first, but statistically, every fraction counted. The pattern hinted at a future where global trade resembled a mosaic rather than a monolith. The United States still sat at the center, but its leverage now depended on the network it had built rather than the resources it controlled. Aircraft carriers could protect sea lanes, but not data flows. The true battlefield of the 21st century was digital finance. Who owned the infrastructure through which value moved? American institutions still processed the majority of international payments, yet rivals were closing the technological gap. Europe developed its own instant settlement systems. China launched the cross-border interbank payment system to reduce reliance on the dollar-centric SWIFT network. For the first time in modern history, there were parallel roads for global money to travel. This competition didn't mean immediate collapse for the dollar. It meant context. When every nation has alternatives, dominance becomes a choice rather than a default. That subtle shift undermines the psychological edge the U.S. has enjoyed since 1971. In a world of instant currency conversions and algorithmic exchanges, the defining asset is no longer metal or oil, but trust in data security and governance. Questions once reserved for economists are now asked by technologists. Who controls the code behind the currency? At home, the Federal Reserve faced its own transformation. After decades mastering the analog mechanisms of interest rates and bond purchases, it began testing a digital dollar, an official counterpart designed to maintain influence as cash declined. Advocates said it would modernize payments and reinforce the dollar's global position. Critics saw something more unsettling, a system where every transaction could, in theory, be monitored or blocked. The same technology that promised efficiency also threatened privacy. The debate revealed how money, politics, and personal freedom had become inseparable threads in the same network. Globally, nations treated the moment as an arms race of credibility. The European Central Bank explored the digital euro. India launched pilot programs for its e-rupee. The competition wasn't about replacing the dollar overnight, but ensuring that if it stumbled, alternatives already existed. Each digital rollout chipped away at the notion of an unchallengeable reserve currency. In practice, the dollar remained dominant. In imagination, it was no longer alone. Yet for all the excitement over digital wallets and multipolar finance, the deeper story remained human. Around the world, people confronted the consequences of half a century of inflation and debt. Housing costs outpacing wages, savings losing meaning, younger generations questioning the fairness of systems built before they were born. In that climate, the appeal of transparent or decentralized money was emotional as much as economic. Trust had migrated from governments to algorithms, from policy committees to open source code. It was the newest version of the same craving that once tied money to gold, a desire for something solid behind the promise. The irony is that even as technology multiplies options, the world remains entwined with the dollar because of inertia. American financial markets are vast, its legal system predictable, its currency the default benchmark for assets from oil to semiconductors. Every global shock, bank failures, pandemics, wars, still pushes investors toward U.S. Treasury bonds. Each panic reasserts the old pattern: flee to familiarity. The fortress may have cracks, but it's still the only one large enough to shelter everyone. Still, the direction of momentum is unmistakable. Where the 20th century revolved around the dollar because it was tied to resources, first gold, then oil, the 21st revolves around data and distribution. Whoever writes the dominant payment protocols will wield power similar to the one Washington held after Bretton Woods. The question is whether that authority will fragment among regional blocs or remain with a single, adaptable issuer. Mid this transition, the psychology Nixon set in motion finds its final expression. His decision replaced metal with faith. Digital finance replaces faith with code. Each step further abstracts money from the physical world, turning it into pure information. Nations now compete not to mine gold or drill oil, but to manage networks that validate transactions billions of times per second. Monetary power has become an engineering problem. For average citizens, the implications are both mundane and profound. Paying with a smartphone feels frictionless, but it also means money exists only as database entries that can change with policy or software updates. The same trust once placed in vaults is now vested in encryption. Stability depends on cyber resilience as much as economic policy. A breach or glitch could do what wars once did, cripple a nation's currency overnight. Yet optimism persists. Just as the end of Bretton Woods birthed new mechanisms, the digital era could yield safer, more inclusive systems if managed wisely. Digital currencies might cut remittance costs, expand banking access, or reduce corruption. They might also magnify inequality if control remains centralized. The stakes echo the 1971 moment, whether monetary evolution serves the public or entrenches power. Looking at this unfolding contest, it's tempting to ask if the dollar's story is ending. In reality, it's adapting once again, shedding its industrial age armor for a digital skin. Its survival may depend less on coercion than cooperation, retaining trust by sharing the stage rather than dominating it. From gold to oil to code, each epoch of money adds a layer to the same narrative. Humanity searching for another form of certainty in an uncertain world. When future historians study this age, they might note that the dollar never truly died. It kept reincarnating into whatever medium existed to carry belief. The challenge now is that belief travels faster than ever and can shift with a tap. Confidence, not conquest, will decide the next reserve currency. The empire of paper has become the empire of data, and its borders are drawn in algorithm. Whether the greenback continues to rule or becomes one voice in a global chorus, the legacy of 1971 endures. Value will always rest on trust. Only the tools of that trust keep changing. The dollar's death wasn't a collapse, it was a transformation. In 1971, the United States didn't lose its wealth, it rewrote the definition of wealth itself. Gold vanished from the promise, but something far more fragile took its place: trust. Every dollar printed since then has been a silent contract built on belief that debts will be honored, that oil will keep trading, that confidence will endure longer than doubt. That collective faith became the real reserve behind the world's most powerful currency. Half a century later, the pattern is unmistakable. The gold standard made money disciplined, the petrodollar made it indispensable, fiat freedom made it dangerous. Each stage solved one crisis and planted the seed for the next. The dollar's strength allowed nations to grow, but also to borrow without end. Its dominance kept trade stable, yet left the developing world carrying the burden of currencies they didn't control. Prosperity spread unevenly, following the flow of credit instead of creation. And now, as digital money rises and global order shifts, the question that began in 1971 still hangs in the air. What gives money its worth when its anchor is gone? Gold once offered certainty, oil offered necessity, but faith has limits. The system survives only as long as people keep believing the story that paper can stand in for substance, and now that code can stand in for paper. The irony is that knowing how the dollar survived makes you more powerful than the system itself. Because once you understand that money is not backed by metal, but by mutual confidence, you see the truth hiding in plain sight. Value is a human invention, maintained through habit, trust, and fear of what happens if belief breaks. So the next time you hold a dollar, remember what really supports it. Not gold in a vault, not oil under sand, but a fragile agreement between billions of people to keep the illusion alive. That's not weakness, it's the most extraordinary act of cooperation in history. The dollar didn't die, it evolved into faith made visible. But faith is only as strong as our understanding of it, and now that understanding is yours.